Welcome everybody. This is the panel that's going to speak to the 100th anniversary of the voting rights for women. And it's an important topic, and it fits into a stream of events that influence the way we approach women politically and then ultimately socially and economically. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens without antecedents. There were many things that went on before this amendment was proposed and eventually passed. It became an amendment to the Constitution. Many things have happened after that. Many laws have been passed. Attempt to have other constitutional amendments that speak to the issue that have not succeeded. But we bring ourselves to a point in time where there is more attention to it. I think too that we keep in mind that having a constitutional amendment, passing laws, is all good things to have happen. But in the realities of things, it is the social and economic realities, the realities of the culture that really influence how people are treated, and particularly with women. It was not until 1967 in the state of Texas that women had the right to control their own property, to contract in their own name. So it's too late in our history that those things were set to rights. Prior to that, the husband could control all the property, community property, which would include a woman's property, real property, wages and salaries that they earned in their own jobs, or the profits that they earned from a business that they owned and controlled. After that, at least it was set to the point of where a woman could control her own destiny in terms of her economics. Socially, we have moved along at a pretty slow pace, and today we're going to try to explore some of those paces and places that we've been. And I'm going to ask each of these individuals here to introduce themselves. We'll start down there at the end. And then after you've been introduced, then we will start and you can present your position.
Well, I'm Anisa. I'm an adjunct here at Weatherford. I'm a 2005 Madison Fellow, and I am a early Constitution and Republic historian.
My name is Lacy McGowan. I am a dual credit instructor for Weatherford College. I'm an M.ED at Weatherford High School.
And I'm Linda Lang, and I'm also a dual credit instructor, and I'm an M.ED at Springtown High School.
I'm Sarah Locke. I'm the Associate Dean of Dual Credit and eLearning at Weatherford College and have been a faculty member in the English department here.
Okay, so should I want me to stand?
What are you comfortable doing?
I got to stand. So what I'd like us to do is take a quick back journey because I think we all can kind of start assimilating the 1830s to the Seneca Falls Conventions and things like that. What I'd like to do is go back a lot further than that, because I often wonder, where did things get started? Where was the seed planted? Where was the conversation? And so we're going to go way back a little bit, actually to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. That's 1517. He presents this idea that we can kind of switch from the religion of the day, the staunch, almost very binding religion, and he makes the statement that men and women are seen equal in the Bible. Okay, that's a big statement. He also makes the statement that we equally, male and female, receive grace freely. So that is a conversation starter, and what I mean by that is it starts women thinking. It may not have been verbal, but they start thinking about equality long before the 19th Amendment ever passed. So it starts a conversation. the early colonies, a lot of them come from a religious bent. And so you have these Protestants, you have these secular religions moving out, and you have conversations yet again. You have women working in equal labor with their spouses and the men. And then all of a sudden you see many governments form in these colonies, and they almost lose some equality. Okay, so it's kind of this colonial ebb and flow that we kind of take and we get back, and we take and we get back. But it wasn't this push for, we want to vote. It was the conversation. So then we're going to fast forward a little bit, and we're going to talk about, let's say, the Sugar Act, Revolution, pre-Revolution, post-French and Indian War. That tax, the sugar tax, directly reflects the women's what I call lane. And they talked about it in the previous set, how women had their domain, and that was the home. Well, if you don't have sugar, ladies, it's very hard to stay in your lane. I mean, you need sugar, and they drink tea. You need sugar, and so they had to get creative on what to do, and they had to start improvising, and they felt almost empowered, because this is a tax that directly affected the women, because it directed their lane. You see where I'm going with this? So, and again, it starts a conversation. And you have women saying, you know what? This is kind of a disparaging issue. We don't, it's not like they're championing we want to go vote. It's they're saying, we have a voice, even if it's amongst a few of us, or amongst a few of us, or amongst a few, we start having a voice. Okay, so you get to the revolution, and you have women pulling all kinds of rank in the revolution, whether they wanted to or not. They're living through loss, but death, destruction. And through that, you have yet another voice. And it was interesting that, I believe it was Dr. Fink talked about how war kind of is the catalyst a lot of time for the change. So you have the Revolutionary era coming, and you have Mercy Otis Warren, who is, we're in the thralls of trying to figure out what to do post-revolution, and our country is in this epic kind of shambles. And she's basically telling John Adams, we have some rights that we should by right get, and one of them is an education. These are very brilliant women. And John Adams listens to her. And she becomes one of his almost confidants until she gets too out there and he kind of disowns her. But that's a whole other story. And then you have his own wife going, remember, honey, in that famous quote, by Abigail Adams, remember the ladies, and he pretty much brushes her off. But yet she's planting the seed to the conversation. You have Mary Wollstonecraft, who is over in England, and she's becoming extremely verbal, and she's going to utter in the late 1700s the right to vote, and she gets ostracized by a lot of the women because she's too out there. But she makes the statement, and she starts the conversation. And I think a lot of these women get pushed aside as not that they're not important, but they're not the forefront. But I think they deserve a lot of the credit for being the ones that start pushing for an education. Can you imagine, women, that if we didn't have an equal opportunity to an education? These are brilliant women, and they're saying, all we want is to be able to be educated like our male counterparts, and we fully believe that we can hold our own. That's all we want. And I think it was interesting in last session, too, those women were championing rights most of the time to quote-unquote, I call it stay in their lane. They kind of referred to it as in a different manner, but it was the same type thing. But it was those sparks that were going to lead to a bigger catalyst in the 1830s and on. And so that era is something that I want us to remember those ladies, so to speak, as they paved the way for, I believe, the forerunners of the later subsequent movements in the next decade. So that's where we're going.
I need to come over to the podium. This is my first time participating.
Yeah.
So I'm a little nervous. And so I do have a few notes that I'm probably going to have to refer to. When I was first asked to do this, I sort of talked myself into doing this, I realized that I'm a woman, and I know that, teach history, so I know the narrative, Seneca Falls, all of that. But I go, I wanted to add something new to the conversation. And so I picked up a book. It's a novel idea. Didn't hit the internet yet first, actually picked up a book. And it was about women's suffrage. And I was struck by one of the first comments that this book said, it said that women had actually been voting in America for a long, long time. And they said before European contact. And so that was sort of like this aha moment that I realized we don't talk a lot about Native Americans in this process, right? They're, as they have been in our history, been somewhat marginalized. And so it made me think about this fact that women's, and actually the gentleman who spoke about Utah, that we tend to feel that this is a linear progression, right? That we got this gain, and we got this gain, and we got this gain. But really kind of the history of women's rights has been sort of gains and losses and gains and losses, right? And so I thought that the Native American story kind of illustrated that. So these are some couple of thoughts. So if you'll indulge me, I will read just a tiny bit. So anyway, I was reminded that tribal societies were required, they needed the labors of all individuals, right? Men and women participated and had roles in society. Native American women in many clans were important to the clan structure. There were cultures that children and husbands actually went to live with the woman's family. That material goods were often passed along on the woman's side, right, matrilineal side. That divorce was easier. That women served on tribal councils, that they voted in important tribal decisions, and that they were sometimes leaders. And so this was a reminder that we actually had a history, we had an example of women exercising quite a bit of autonomy and power here on this North American continent. And so this then went into this conversation about that as much as we tend to treat Native Americans and women as almost separate, and white women as separate entities, they of course certainly saw each other and interacted. And I ran across, because we know that European women and then less American women had less autonomy, lack of property rights, lack of political power. And so I ran across suffragist Matilda Jocelyn Gage. She actually lived in New York. She lived near the Iroquois Confederacy, and she actually interacted. In fact, she interacted so much she was actually given a honorary membership to the Mohawk Nation. And so they use these examples as for justification to show that yes, women can exercise power. So this is going to energize a lot of the early suffragists. So we know enough about throughout the 1800s territorial expansion in North America is going to, of course, create this debate, where do Native Americans even sit in our society? And we know that basically the reservation system, government legislation, war are going to weaken that tribal society. Efforts to assimilate especially are going to whittle away the rights of women in, Native American women in their own tribes. As they assimilate, unfortunately they also assimilate that sort of white, that white male dominance that existed in the time period. And so women within the Native American will lose power. We know that, of course, Native Americans really were not included in the 14th Amendment, and they're going to continue to battle a system that they actually don't have rights in the whites nation, and they actually have trouble exercising rights in their own nation. And so then I ran across a couple of notable women that the first Native American novelist, Sophia Alice Callahan, she, in her 1891 novel, explored women's rights and Native rights, including suffrage. So that's early in that fight. Activist Zakala Sa fought for the rights of her people, and she's actually going to be one of the ones active in helping to get the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. And so women are going to have an important role in gaining rights, not only for women, but for all of their people. So when the right to vote was granted to women, that still actually meant very little to Native American women, right? Because Native Americans weren't fully given citizenship until 1924. And that was one of the points that we had talked about, was the fact that, that I know that we're going to explore, is that even once we get that amendment is still limited, right? And so Native Americans are a good example of that. And so even once the Citizenship Act happens, Native Americans are subject to the poll tax in many states. They're subject to literacy tests in many states. And so again, it's still a way that we have this amendment, but it isn't guaranteeing all women the right to vote. And so we do eventually get changes at a state-by-state level. And then, of course, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 helps, start ending that. But I would argue that there's still challenges that they're facing. A couple of things I ran into when I was looking at more recent stuff is this idea of political power. There was a very recent case that the Navajo Nation won because of gerrymandering. Because Native Americans, thus women, are getting excluded as a result of gerrymandering. And then very recent, they were talking about the current census that was coming up, that Native Americans are very difficult to count, right? Many of them are in reservations, they're in areas, and if they're not counted properly, then again, their potential representation is left out. And so even today, we still are grappling with this idea that the vote isn't enough, right? We need to be represented. And then my final thoughts were a couple of things I thought about was, we know, and that was brought up in the last one, is participating in the political process. I don't know, I ran across when I was looking, sorry, my mouth is really dry, that Wilma Mankiller. I don't know how many people read about her, but if you haven't, she's really cool. By the way, she's really seriously cool. I won't even get into her incredible history, but she was a Cherokee of the Cherokee Nation, and she did a lot for her community. She's going to rise up. Well, she's going to have a chance in 1983 to run for the deputy, like kind of almost like the vice president of the Cherokee Nation, the deputy chief. And there was this opposition, like there's people that literally kept coming to her house going, don't run, don't run, don't run. And it had nothing to do about her capabilities. Every single time they said, you shouldn't run because you're a woman. And this is 1983 in America, amongst a society that once honored women. So the irony was not lost on her. And yet she will then get the principal chief, and she will actually serve for another decade and do wonderful things for her people. And then the last thing was, in 2018, for the first time ever, 2 Native Americans were elected to Congress.
Yeah.
So we have made progress, but my last statement was, while much progress was gained, I think looking at Native Americans, you see that, one, you have to be very careful, rights aren't secure, that we have to remain vigilant, and that this is something that's an ongoing battle, that it's not settled and it's not done. So, that's fine.
When we talked about this panel, we talked about wanting to bring some nuance to the idea of, the passage of the 19th Amendment, women getting the right to vote in 1920, and we've had some of that here, where have women's voices been heard before? Where are they now? But also, as Linda mentioned earlier, who was excluded from this conversation? Because if we think about, okay, women got the right to vote, if you have in your head an idea of a suffragist, what does she look like? She's probably white, probably middle class, probably single, but the talk about women's rights and the suffrage movement as part of that, has to include factors other than middle class white womanhood, or it's not a full discussion. This has been true the whole way along, as Linda was talking about with Native American rights, but also how the fight for suffrage and the fight for freedom for African-descended peoples in the U.S., for non-white people generally in the U.S., those movements kind of go like this, as you probably know. So if we talk about the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which was in New York and was, mostly white women saying, we need to vote, but not exclusively. They were active politically already in abolition, definitely in women's rights movements. There were Quakers who, for religious reasons were very involved politically. But the concept of women's suffrage, as we keep mentioning this previous session, which was about women's right to vote in Western states and territories, where they were sometimes granted the right to vote in several cases before the national amendment passed. So they talked about the idea of separate spheres, that women were considered to have one sphere, the sphere of the home, the domestic sphere. Men's sphere was the public sphere, and so women didn't need to vote because they were in the home. And if they wanted to influence their husbands and their sons, they could do that in the home. And they didn't need to get sullied by the dirty public world of politics. But if we think about that, that only applies to certain women. So if a woman was a slave, she didn't have her own home. She didn't have a domestic space of her own. If a woman was white and working class and worked in a factory, she was already out in public, and she did work outside of the home. So the idea of separate spheres only, accounts for a certain version of womanhood. This comes to a head especially after, lots happened, of course, in the middle, and there were, for instance, Sojourner Truth, who you've probably heard of. She was a black woman from a northern state, New York, was a freed slave, but again, from the north. She was never a southern slave, who did speak at a women's rights event in the 1850s, and we've recorded the speech as "Aren't I a Woman" or "Ain't I a Woman," but really they've gone back and looked at some transcripts at the time, and the original version was not, it didn't say "Ain't I a Woman" or "Aren't I a Woman." The later version was written in a southern dialect and was a particular version of black womanhood. But she was saying, I'm strong and I'm capable. I do the things that a man does. I am a woman. I need to be included in the conversation. So there were black women participating in this movement at the time. But it gets really tense in the suffrage movement after the Civil War, because when the 14th Amendment grants everybody equal protection under the law, and then the 15th Amendment says you can't exclude someone from citizenship or voting based on race, some white women suffragists at the time got very upset that black men would get the right to vote before white women did. And so it puts people in tension with each other. And there was a split in the suffrage movement at the time of women who said, no, we're not going to support the 15th Amendment because it doesn't include women, and women who said suffragists who said we are going to support the 15th Amendment because it extends the franchise. It gives freedom to people who need it. It's not where we want to end up, but it's pushing us in a direction where the vote is opening up. So there was tension. And there was always tension within what was considered to be the women's movement. And this is the 19th century, but as Dan was saying, women couldn't, in many cases, hold their own property. They couldn't sue for divorce on their own unless their husband initiated it. So if they were a victim of domestic violence or something, they couldn't necessarily take control of where their future was going. They were excluded from professions, excluded from educational opportunities, in some places, employment, but again, depending on social class. So we have to think about all these things. Today, the term that we use to talk about this is intersectionality, where different identities intersect. And I think the best title of any work that I can think of that talks about this is in the early 1980s, there was a black woman scholar who wrote a book, edited an anthology called "All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave." In other words, she's saying, when we talk about women, we assume we're thinking white women. When we talk about black people, we assume we're talking about men, but where does that leave people who are both women and black? We're excluded from these conversations. So as Linda said earlier, when the 19th Amendment passed, it did not include Native women for the most part, because Native women were mostly excluded from citizenship until 1924. Black women were still subject to voter suppression. Brown women were still subject to voter suppression. So if there was, poll tax, literacy tests, language tests, lots of women were still excluded because they couldn't get to vote for any of those reasons. So not everybody got an equal opportunity to vote in 1920. I'll pass it along to you.
So imagine it's 1921. You're walking through Washington, D.C. It's a chilly 39 degrees, and you're on your way to the first convention of the National Woman's Party since the ratification of the 19th Amendment. You step into the venue, you shake off the cold, and you realize that Nora Barney is already speaking. She's discussing the idea of pressing for more rights for women. More rights, you think? We just won the biggest right of all. But you keep listening, and you realize this is a bigger push for women's rights, another constitutional amendment that will bring about absolute equality for women. You leave the convention energized. Well, in 1923, Alice Paul submits what will become known as the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. It's at this 75th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention that the ERA is unanimously approved. It reads, "Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction." The National Women's Party and others support the amendment, yet this amendment would not be without detractors. Reformers who had made progress in the working rights for women believed that the ERA would overturn all of the progress that had been made for women in the workplace. This will prove to be a fight that pits women against men and even women against women. Well, in 1943, Alice Paul rewrites the ERA in order to reflect the verbiage of the 15th and the 19th Amendments. This new ERA states, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." However, this new verbiage did not bridge the gap between the supporters of the amendment and the supporters of protective workplace laws. The ERA wouldn't garner enough support to help hoist it into the annals of constitutional history, and here it just gets shuffled under some other papers. The 1960s arrived with this deafening war, and with the fight for African American rights being played out in the federal government, women decided it's finally time that we should bring the ERA back, and we should bring it into the light. And when they do, they bring many supporters. With this new backing and a new call for the extension of equality to all, the Equal Rights Amendment will be successful in passing both houses of Congress. And on March 22nd, 1972, the proposed 27th Amendment to the United States leaves Washington, D.C. on its way to the states for ratification. With a 7-year deadline on the ratification process, 22 of the 38 states needed for ratification will do so in the very first year. After that, the ratification ebbs. Now, one of the biggest opponents of the ERA will be Phyllis Schlafly. Schlafly and other anti-ERA protesters claim that the ERA would prohibit women from being supported by their husbands. They also claim that privacy would be overturned, women would be sent into combat, and abortion rights and homosexual marriages would be upheld. Schlafly and her cohort utilized these scare tactics in their quest to stamp out the ERA and push back against equality for all. By 1979, the date of the deadline for ratification, the ERA was 3 states shy of ratification. However, the advocates for the ERA will be successful in getting the deadline extended to 1982. But 1982 comes and goes, and the ERA will still be 3 states shy. Even after the deadline, states are still working on ratification. In 2017, Nevada becomes the 36th state to ratify. Illinois follows with ratification in 2018. And just this year, Virginia, with a new surge of women holding positions in the state legislature, will become the 38th state to ratify the ERA. The question is now, where does the ERA go from here? It's been 38 years since the last deadline. In today's political climate, can the ERA successfully be added to the United States Constitution? And if so, where does this leave members of the LGBTQ+ community, specifically gender nonconforming and trans members? And right now, it seems like it will not go anywhere. The House Democrats earlier this month voted to expand the deadline for ratification. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, said it would be very unlikely that the Senate would even take it up. And even Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a longtime supporter of the ERA, says she would like to see a new beginning for the ERA. Seemingly, the ERA does need a new beginning, one that will bring the ERA into a modern light, include everyone in the definition of equality, no matter how they identify.
We've had interesting conversations here about the 19th Amendment. I thought maybe I would read it to you, what it actually says. Rights of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. In less than 40 words, a very powerful statement was made. But its promise has not been realized in the sense that the right to vote is not necessarily the path to equality. There are many other facets of equality: social, economic, cultural, that still create impediments for the equality of women. This has been a continuum that began back in, before America even existed, and was steeped in religious beliefs. But there are religious beliefs currently which really stand in the way. Fundamentalism says that the woman is the weaker vessel, they have to be protected. And so much of that has happened. The real irony is that the thing that really slows down equality for women is the fact that men want to retain their power, they want to retain their control over society, culture, money, politics. To give that up seems to be very difficult. But I think that progress has been made, and it is individuals like our panel who speak out, who know, educate themselves, and bring these things to our attention and persist in what they try to accomplish. The persistence is important to sustain the effort and put the energy that's required to change things that seem so fundamental. So thank you and congratulations for that kind of effort. We'd like to see that if anybody has any questions or any of the panelists have any comments to make about what they've heard and what's going on.
I would like to add, I love all how we didn't, I don't know that we even planned this, but it's very timeline appropriate. I think it worked out beautifully. I know back in the era that I love to study, the few women that were educated had to speak for those that weren't. And you did see the thread through history where the women's rights and the abolitionist movement were threaded together very much so until it did split kind of as you were speaking to earlier. So I feel like if we watch the ebb and the flow of the movement, again, we've taken strides. We have much farther to go, I believe, but there were so many women that even through this process have been left behind, and I think that's why we still speak. Is my point.
Anybody else? Okay. What about out here? All right. Well, we've got some time left over. In America, our founding documents were very expressive and very much in anticipation of perfection. And when we said that all men are created equal and that there were equal rights, that has never been something that we've been able to live up to. And the persistence that we were talking about is necessary for us to recognize that. Until there is equality in economics, and that is not that women not only work, but they get paid for what they do as if they were equal to men. That whenever it comes to the social, cultural view of women's values, until that catches up with the promise that we made as a country, then it won't become reality.
I think actually it's something that I was pondering, and I think that it's fun, we did sort of cross-platform, we get those people out of the process, and you made a comment that was sort of thought off and on is, you know, that part of the problem is that men don't want to give up power. And I think part of the narrative that's happening that somehow we need to change is, there's this idea that if you give something up, like, that somebody has to lose for somebody else to get. And I think that's not a good way to look at it, is why can't both benefit? And I think actually in that past discussion about the West, that is actually kind of what happened. That I think that's, somehow we've got to change that narrative that, you know, okay, if men give up some kind of political power, then they're losing. Because I don't think they are. Aren't we really ultimately all gaining? And somehow along the way we need to change that narrative and change that idea that if we let, you know, Latinos, if we let African Americans, if we let Native Americans, then somebody must be losing. And I don't understand that personally. I struggle with that because I don't know why we have to think that way. And so I think that's one change that I feel that.
Part of what I think happens, not only here but in other countries, I'm sure, is that we've approached our society and our politics as adversarial. That we believe that there's a dynamic tension and that tension creates progress magically as things go on. Well, it doesn't necessarily happen that way. You know, if I'm in a tug of war and I've got 50 people on my side and you've got 4 on yours, we're going to pull you where we want to pull you. So the distribution of power in this adversarial system retards the progress that we promise ourselves we make by considering both sides. I think that in many instances that push and pull does create progress. We politically swing from one extreme to another extreme, and those extremes sort of exhaust people, and they want to come back to something a little more neutral and maybe over to the other side. But the zero-sum attitude toward things is common in our culture. That I can't win unless you lose. All right. Yes, sir.
One of the other things that struck me, and this is actually off of what Lacy was talking about with the ERA, especially talking about the 2 versions of it, you know, the version in the 20s and the version that came in the 40s. And this is something I've been talking in my history classes more and more the last couple of years, is the sort of the negative rights versus positive rights thing. That we tend to more likely favor we're going to keep something from being limited because you are something in a negative way, rather than saying you have this right to do something. And I hadn't even really thought about the fact that, you know, because you said the change from the 20s to the 40s was the flipping of that, because the 20s one was, we are all equal. The 40s one was, well, you can't take away our equality because we are women. So I don't know if anyone has a thought on that, because it's something it's been developing in my mind for the past couple of years, and I think there may be a couple of my students out here that I do talk about it in my classes as well. So if anybody had any thoughts on that?
Are you asking us? I do think there's a shift, and I think we see it through time and as the ebb and flow has happened, and I totally agree. And I feel like, you know, as I was looking at some of these questions, kind of along the same thing that I talk to my students on is that, yes, the 19th Amendment was passed, but it's just like emancipation. It didn't just fix everything. It's not like, oh, it's this magic wand and we're all equal and everybody's singing Kumbaya and everything's happy. Like, that doesn't happen. And so the reality of the shift in the verbiage matters. I think the language matters, and where it starts and then where it ends, in the first version versus the last version. I think it gives you a good perspective of where the women or society was at the time. You know, I look at, and I have students ask me all the time, well, I don't understand why it didn't just fix it. And I said, well, because it's a social and a respect and a change and a mindset, and there's all these things that have to come into play. And you were right, the sum factor where everybody's pulling and pushing, instead if we could just agree that we may differ, but we're all trying to get to the same end. And I think that's the difference. And I think the language that you spoke of is huge, because to me it does say, in epic proportions, where the women were specifically in both those time periods.
And I think that, I think that the issue here is that it has to change, right? We can't just keep the status quo, because the status quo is not working. And if we keep on that same path, it's like the definition of insanity. You keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. That's where we're at, and it's insanity. So we have to make that change. And even as we push forward in society, and we have to become, again, not just a rhetoric about men versus women. It's now men versus women versus, our brothers and sisters who don't conform to those prescribed genders. So where do they fit? So even the 1940s rhetoric now has to change, which is why.
And that's what I think, because even the 1940s one was just sex, whereas what the earlier one, it had more than just sex in it, didn't it? I mean, I felt a broader sense than that. Even you kind of got narrowed.
And granting someone the right to vote doesn't change the structures of our government, of our property ownership system, of our educational systems, of the legal system, the judicial system. Those structures aren't automatically changed. So if they're set up to benefit certain people, that doesn't change automatically by granting a certain group the right to vote.
Well, I'm just wondering, Scott, when you're talking about positive and negative rights, is really the difference between a statement of granting someone rights or assuming that the right exists and defending that right.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that goes back to the Declaration of Independence, the idea that these rights are endowed by the Creator.
Well, that's what Lacy put that
to bridge those rights.
Yeah, returning to the way the other ones have been, as she said. I mean, that is,
Well,
that
it's
is the
worth
tradition.
mentioning at this point, I think, that at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, they issued a Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled exactly on the Declaration of Independence, and had the underlying assumption that women had the rights. They were just being denied, that they had, back to, British common law or whatever, we have the rights, they're just being infringed upon by the law.
Yeah, I mean, the example I always go back to is, granting black men the right to vote, or all men the right to vote. It says you can't discriminate based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But you sure can discriminate on a whole bunch of other things, because it's not, that's the only things you're saying you can't discriminate on, versus saying all men can vote. We take those, one of those two approaches, and we tend to take.
We're still dealing with this with protected classes, right? Who has rights, and do we have to delineate those rights? Do we have to each group that has the rights, or are we simply saying people have rights?
Yeah, everybody, which is what the 14th Amendment should have done. 14th Amendment was supposed to have done that, and it didn't. But
Well, to your point, way back in 1792, Judith Murray writes a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. So she lays it out. We have them. And she at first had to do it under a pseudonym because, coming from a man, it's bad. Coming from a woman, it's like, what are you doing? But she is also starting to lay out what you were referring to is assuming these rights, So yeah, I think you're exactly right.
Yes, ma'am.
I wondered if y'all had any thoughts about, we got the right to vote in 1920. What happens in 1921? Margaret Sanger says, you know what? We have a right over our bodies, and started the birth control league in 1921. And fast forward, there seems to be a systematic, in the last decade or so, different ways of disenfranchising voters, going after Planned Parenthood, where women are struggling, because that's the first thing, your agency comes from your ability to control your reproductive future in order to work, get an education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not only that, I was having a hard time thinking which thing I wanted to ask because we're running out of time. But do you have any thoughts about that, how they're going after those rights, as well as even the Native Americans in North Dakota? They had to get their special, ID because they don't do addresses the same way we do. Gerrymandering. Any number of ways that, okay, we've got some language here, but we're just going to go after it a different way to prevent you from being fully in part of the political system and rights and thereof.
It sort of touches on something I was about when you were about to speak. I was thinking, which is kind of what I closed with, is we are still, we can vote all day long, but until we are physically makers of laws, and until we are people that are actually represented adequately in the lawmaking, level, I think we're going to continue to suffer. And the very fact that we're still, to this day and age, and we're still, aren't we the only industrial nation that's never had a woman leader or something like that, It's very, or very close anyway. We're still, that recent Congress, we're still way underrepresented. We were so excited about how many people got voted in. Mm-hmm. So to me, for me anyway, I'm thinking we physically need to be in the trenches, so to speak. And there's a lot of different factors that seem to, within women themselves versus outside.
When we look at the timeline of this entire historical narrative from pre-colonialization to today, I think the general topic that we're talking about here is immigration resistance. And the reason that I frame it that way is because when you think about the timelines that we're talking about here and that we've broken into all of these different sections, this session, the previous session, whatnot, with women getting equal rights, with people of different colonialization getting different rights, with people of different gender identification getting equal rights, the difficulty I think that they're having is just about the time we see a step forward in the political environment in our country where laws are changed, where amendments are made to our Constitution, or at least they're offered to our Constitution. We see a new immigration wave that brings to this country from some other part of the world old world mentality. When you stop and think about that, those first-line immigrants will take decades to become citizens, but their progeny will take 1 or 2 decades to become citizens. But they will vote primarily on the ideals they are taught in their homes. So you may be looking at an intense multi-generational development in order to see the progress that I think everyone's asking for.
I'm going to counter that just a little bit by saying that I think immigration and women's rights, just like immigration and abolition movements, also do this. In the previous session, for those of you who aren't in there, they talked about white women being granted the right to vote in Wyoming, in part because the idea was, okay, if we're having non-white men move into the state, we need to grant white women the right to vote so that we, the people in power, maintain that power. So in the progressive era where immigration does this at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, you get a lot of discourse. And this is where some of the uncomfortable part of the women's rights movement comes in, where it becomes, okay, well, white women should have the right to vote so that we can counter the black or brown people moving in who don't think like we do. Please see my air quotes. This is the discourse. And so, but at the same time, there was all kinds of discussion of if we let women go to college, they're not going to have enough white babies. So we're in danger too. So the narratives about immigration and citizenship get complicated by race and sex, gender, all the time. And so those things, the whole point, I guess, of all of this is you can't really separate one strand only and say, okay, this is just, we're going to look at the women's rights movement all by itself, because it interacts with citizenship, immigration, bodies, all kinds of things. And so the discourse about who's having babies, impacts women's rights and citizenship rights and immigration and all kinds of things. So, that is part of it. It absolutely becomes about who's going to have the power and whether that is a zero-sum game.
And I absolutely agree with you, and I think that the scales have only now reached the tipping point where we have a large enough domestic population within our country, because our country's still only 200 plus years old, right? We tend to think that's a long time. In America, we think 100 miles is nothing. In Europe, they think 100 years is nothing, right? So we need to reframe the way that we look at ourselves first. And if we think of these waves, these population waves that we have, right? We think of them as waves crashing upon the sand. The waves crash upon the sand, they push the water up. Well, some of that water tries to make its way back, and as it's making progress, another wave crashes in on top of it. It does take time for those things to change, for the sand dunes to form, if you will, right?
Well, suffice it to say that this issue is complicated. You know, that many things intermingle with one another. And I think there was a comment earlier about language. And if you go back and look at the Equal Rights Amendment, it says, you know, the vote shall not be denied or abridged. Well, immediately after that, it was abridged. It was denied through various mechanisms that avoided the direct language of the amendment. And if we look at our founding documents, lots of energy has been spent trying to deny the obvious intent of the Declaration of Independence and parts of the Constitution. We have a tendency to try to retain power and influence and guard it very closely because we don't want to share that with somebody else because they may put us on the outside of the bus, you know. So we have to guard against that. So I think that the last comment too is that in the grand scheme of social history, the American experiment based on aspirational premise of equality is in its infancy and has on many levels failed to meet its promise, but the experiment is not over. So I think that we can take some heart in the fact that it isn't over, that we are capable of better things, and we're capable of sharing, playing nice with others. Anyway, I'm glad you were here. I hope it was informative, beneficial, perhaps even entertaining.
Thanks, Al.